Welcome back into another episode of the Believe in Georgia Tech podcast. We are your co-hosts. That is RJ Schafer. I'm Jackson Caudell, coming to you on Thursday, October 9th. We're starting to record this at 4:39, and we have a very special guest. Thomas Hughes, lead editor of Virginia Tech on SI, is here to preview the game with us. Thomas, my man, how are you doing?
Doing pretty well. Excited to break down into this with you guys and get into what we think is going to unfold this Saturday.
Absolutely. So Thomas is my colleague. Me and him both, we're working in the same coal mine here with On SI. It's always cool when you can collab like this and kind of give people a perspective on your school. So we really appreciate Thomas coming in to join us here. Before we get started, obviously, if you guys are watching this, haven't subscribed, would love it if you would like the video, follow us wherever you get your podcast, leave us a review. Love hearing that. This is the first time this season, we've had two midweek shows. We've started doing our ACC power rankings and kind of giving a little bit of lay of the land. And according to our power rankings, this is number 2 versus number 14 this week. So this will be kind of interesting. Obviously, Georgia Tech and Virginia Tech have a long history. Like this was such a fun matchup when I was growing up. This was always whoever won this matchup a lot of the times won the ACC Coastal. I know a lot of Georgia Tech fans will never forget the 2009 game. There's so many just great moments, and this is kind of like they've played almost every year except 2023. So Brent Key as an interim and as a head coach is 1-1 against the Hokies. One of his first games, or I won't say one of his first, but when he was the interim coach, they went up to Blacksburg, won that game. Didn't play in 2023. Last year, obviously, they went on the road without Haynes King and lost. It was one of the most boring games I've ever covered as a Georgia Tech football reporter. Like it was, I think, what was it, 21-7? Was that the final?
It was 21-6. Oh, I think like the best word that I can use to describe that game was just an anemic offense from Georgia Tech that never really could get going. And it's like, okay, Virginia Tech, I don't think that they played outstandingly that game, but it was kind of a situation of like, you're going up against like a freshman quarterback who's getting like his first real reps in that sort of situation. So it's like, okay, Virginia Tech probably gets like a C grade from me from that performance, but you did enough. You beat a team that was lacking its primary signal caller. So just that game, I would agree with you when I said that was probably one of the most boring games, but from the Virginia Tech perspective, of course.
So anybody who listens to this podcast knows, like, I'm very grateful for the job I have. I don't take it for granted. And like, I'm always appreciative if this is what I get to do. But I will say that just that 2-game stretch last year with Notre Dame and then Virginia Tech, like that was 2 of the worst games I've had to cover in back. And like a lot of it had to do with Haynes King being out. And, obviously Notre Dame went to the national title, was an excellent team last year. Aaron, like that was the first time we got to see Aaron Philo was last year against Virginia Tech. And, he did his best in that game. I don't have the stats right in front of me, but there was a lot of help me out here, RJ. Wasn't there a lot of drop balls when Aaron Philo come in? Because I want to say like Avery Boyd dropped a pass near the end zone. It was just a very odd game.
It was a messy game. All like the offensive line was off that game too. There were a lot of penalties. Like it was it was a gross football game to watch, and that's an understatement.
Yeah, and like I was up there in Blacksburg, and that was my first time there, and I loved it. Like I want to go back at some point. But yes,
would recommend it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess we'll kind of set the scene a little bit here. Okay, Georgia Tech comes in ranked number 13 in the country. They are 5-0. Virginia Tech coming in at 2-4. So I'll let Thomas take over here in just a second, but obviously, so just going back to. We'll go all the way back to last year. Like you almost could swap Georgia Tech and Virginia Tech. Like, how Georgia Tech came into this year with a little bit of love and a little bit of hype. And that was kind of where Virginia Tech was not just a year ago. They weren't ranked in the preseason, much like Georgia Tech, but there was a lot of, hey, they can make the ACC title game. I think did Pat McAfee pick them to make the playoffs?
It was Pat McAfee. He was he was kind of putting a little sleeper hints out there, being like, okay, maybe Virginia Tech wouldn't be my first pick to win the ACC title, but it seemed like he was kind of on board of the idea of, well, I could see Virginia Tech sneaking into the CFP, making a little bit of a run here. But it's like you look at that team from last year, and it's like, okay, they went 6-7, lost 5 one-score games, and in each of those games, I think you make a case of like, okay, you switch one play here. Obviously the Miami game, the controversial Hail Mary call, that was obviously a big one. Duke, you consistently get gashed by their wide receivers because your defensive backs aren't able to function really well in coverage. Syracuse as well, you deal with having to rely on College Lee because Kyron Jones shortly before the game is listed as out. But it feels like there was a lot of missed opportunities for Virginia Tech last year to where you're like, okay, you switch around 5 plays. This goes from a team that is 6-7 to 10-2, possibly within a chance of fighting for an ACC title game. And then you look at it from the perspective of, okay, you had 5 guys who were drafted, I think somewhere between 18 and 20 got invited to camp. And then 4 found their way onto the 53-man roster, which is everybody who got drafted except for Philadelphia Eagles edge Antoine Powell-Ryland, who I think is still on their practice squad.
Yeah. Well, that was what I was going to say is, when you look at sometimes when you have teams that disappoint, maybe they weren't as talented as we all thought. That team had legit dudes on it. 5 players were drafted. And then some of the transfer portal's best players, Mansour, Delane's killing it at LSU. Berlin Moore is killing it at LSU. I know Chaplin's struggling a little bit at Auburn, but some of the best transfer portal players from this past year are legit NFL dudes. It's just kind of wild to see how things spiraled. They went 6-7, decided to bring back Brent Pry for another year. He hires 2 new coordinators. They actually played fairly well against South Carolina. I'm not going to say they were really good and just lost a great game, but the
defense played very well. Yeah, I think the defense played very well. And then, you have the special teams gaffe where Vicarious Swain takes it to the house. I think that was probably the moment when you were like, oh, okay, Virginia Tech has kind of lost control of this game. I don't really know if they ever had it, but the defense, at least then, was keeping them into the game to where you saw some people on social media, talking very positively about what Sam Cephas brought to the defense. Obviously, it seemed like things kind of flipped the other way with the performance that they gave against Vanderbilt and Old Dominion. 89 combined points allowed in both of those games. But then you kind of have a little bit of a bounce-back performance against Wofford, get right game. Then the defense really keyed in against NC State, forced C.J. Bailey into 5 sacks. And I think that if Virginia Tech is going to win this Saturday against Georgia Tech, it has to key in on its defense, especially with getting to the quarterback and limiting the run against Georgia Tech because – you have essentially a two-headed hydra of Haynes. You got Haynes King, you got Jamal Haynes in the backfield. If you can neutralize one of them, or even better yet, both of them, then I think you can get into the discussion of, saying, Virginia Tech has a shot here. They can limit the run defense, and I believe that they have limited their past 3 opponents all under 100 rushing yards. So they've shown that capability against slightly weaker foes, Wake Forest and NC State, kind of around the middle of the ACC. But now you have a really true test, probably either the strongest or the second strongest foe that you faced all year in Georgia Tech.
Yeah, so we'll definitely be getting into all that keys and everything. But I'll just backpedal a little bit because, like you were just saying, defense played really well against South Carolina. I thought it was kind of I don't think anybody expected Virginia Tech to win that game. So it was a somewhat encouraging performance. You never want to be happy after a loss, but it was okay, we didn't get rolled in that game. Let's see what we can do. Played pretty well in the first half against Vanderbilt, and then it snowballed after that. Vanderbilt absolutely just dump trucked Virginia Tech in the second half, blew them out. Then they go into the Old Dominion game. Was it 31-0 at one point?
I believe it was 31-0 at one point in the third quarter. It was 28-0 at halftime. I believe, and this is something that sports journalist David Teal, I believe, tweeted out. There was a 62-0 stretch from the second half of Vanderbilt to the end of the first half against Old Dominion, and then you tack on the extra 3 points. 65-0. I believe that there was a 72-7 stretch somewhere in there if you include other bits of the third quarter. But just Virginia Tech's offense just completely sputtered to begin those first 3 games. You score 11 in the first game against South Carolina, and the vast majority of those points are field goals kicked by John Love, one of the ACC's most reliable place kickers. And then the second game, you're still struggling. You only put up 20 points. And, you're kind of doing really good in the first half, but then it's almost like the faucet turns off in the second half. And then it stays off in the first half against Old Dominion. And I was in the media box for Old Dominion. I've been in the media box for every game so far for home games for Virginia Tech. But when Old Dominion scored their first touchdown, it was kind of like any of the optimism that was surrounding Virginia Tech. It kind of went out the window a little bit to where it's like, okay, now you have an exhale of disappointment. And then they keep on scoring. They keep on scoring some more. And the 45-26 final margin for Old Dominion versus Virginia Tech it's not as close as the score indicates, because that game was not close. I think that the Hokies scored 19 points in the fourth quarter. Does not do it justice for how lopsided that game was against Old Dominion too. And I think that there's a certain sense of irony in that Brent Pry's tenure was essentially bookended by losses to Old Dominion. Starts off his tenure as the Hokies head whistle with a loss to Old Dominion in Norfolk. And then he suffers his last loss to Old Dominion, but this time at Blacksburg. Of note, that was actually Old Dominion's first win in Blacksburg ever. And I believe that since they joined FBS, which I think was in 2014 or 2015, they have a record that's, I believe, somewhere around 3-15 at the time that the game happened, like right after Old Dominion won. All 3 of those wins are against Virginia Tech.
That's college football playoff contender Old Dominion to you, by the way. That's future Sun Belt Conference winner Old Dominion.
Non-zero chance. Zero chance.
But, all right, so after the Old Dominion game, Brent Pry gets fired. Philip Montgomery named interim head coach. They beat Wofford. They go down to Raleigh as double-digit underdogs, and they win. There was a little bit of momentum. I'm not going to say like, the train was getting revved up, everything was going in the right direction. They were a touchdown favorite last week against Wake Forest, who was also Georgia Tech's previous opponent. Lost 30-23 at home, so they sit at 2-4. So I guess we'll kind of start with this. Let's just go over kind of some of the basic stats before we get too deep into the weeds here. So some of this, Georgia Tech comes in averaging 37 points a game, 25th in the country. They are 16th in the nation in rushing yards per game, 59th in passing yards per game, 16th in total offense. It's been pretty good. Me and RJ kind of discussed the offense, kind of some things we'd like to see. But overall, it's been a pretty solid start outside of the turnovers and some of the explosiveness in the passing attack. Defensively for Tech, they're 50th or Georgia Tech, I should say. I can't just say Tech in this game this week.
Yeah, that's like what it is for my game recaps, to where I have to be like, oh, now I have to differentiate between Virginia Tech and Georgia Tech, to where it's like, okay, Virginia Tech plays against Old Dominion. I can just be like, oh, Tech had a good game.
Yeah.
No,
I'm on the same struggle bus this week. 50th in points per game, 105th in rushing yards allowed per game. We're going to get into that in a little bit. 45th in passing yards allowed per game, 66th in total yards allowed per game. On the other side, Virginia Tech comes in offensively averaging 23.5 points a game, which is 96th in the country. They are 69th in rushing yards per game, 90th in passing yards per game, 87th in total yards per game. Defensively, 98th points allowed per game, 55th in rushing yards allowed per game. Passing yards, they're 75th, and they are 65th in total yards per game. So there are a couple things we're going to get into there, because I do think there are some things. The best things Virginia Tech does as a team are some ways that they can hurt Georgia Tech if they come out and play. But I'll kind of bring it back here to when Brent Pry got fired. Philip Montgomery's 2-1. I guess we'll ask you, what's the biggest change you've seen in this team over the past 3 games since making that change?
At least from the mindset, it feels like at least from the mindset that I've got from talking to the guys after practice, for reference, Virginia Tech media does not get to see any practice. Practice is closed to the media. So, you don't really get as great a sense of like the inner workings, what goes on. But when you're speaking to the players in post-practice media, you just get the sense that there's a bit more of a pep in their step. You're coming off of two pretty solid wins. One's a get-right game against an FCS squad, so take with that what you will. But then the second is a one-score win, which was the first in 3 years since Brent Pry's first season against Liberty. It's been a while since Tech has claimed such a cathartic victory like that. And it's okay, now they sort of take a step back against Wake Forest. I think that part of that was self-inflicted. A lot of those points from Wake Forest came about because of penalties from Virginia Tech. I believe you had a holding penalty on offensive lineman Thomas Remack that extended a drive. I believe that led to a Claiborne touchdown. I may have that mixed up with another play. Then there was another one where Caleb Spencer, linebacker, gets hit with an unnecessary roughness call on Robbie Ashford. And Ashford was essentially almost, if not already, out of bounds when Spencer made contact. So it's just, I feel like it's avoidable mistakes. But overall, I think the mood from the team itself is definitely better. But I wouldn't say that it's the feeling of a team that has a concrete sense of direction, but one where a direction is starting to form. It feels like there's a certain degree of buy-in, obviously not from everybody. You've had 4 players transfer out. That would be cornerback Dante Lovett, Tucker Holloway, the wide receiver and punt returner. There's been a big loss on punt return since Holloway left. Linebacker Michael Short, who I believe briefly led the team in tackles. I think he led after one game, and then before that, it was Caleb Woodson, who has been sidelined for the past couple games with an injury. But at least for me, I get the sense that I wouldn't say that Virginia Tech is rudderless right now, but it feels like you're kind of in limbo, where you're kind of in a wait and see. And that extends to multiple things. You're trying to wait and see, okay, do more players enter the transfer portal? Because like I said, you've got those 4 guys, add Keyshawn Burgos into that list. There's also a 5th player who is James Joncom, who came over from Eastern Michigan in the offseason. And you were thinking, okay, he's going to be a great add on the defensive line. He's not on the team anymore. He's been removed from the online roster. And Montgomery said that both him and Burgos, they're no longer with the team. There's a little bit of a question. I believe it was on three's Pete Nakos reported that Burgos was trying to redshirt. There was also some sort of report from, I can't remember who it was, but there was a report that NIL attorney Darren Heitner was retaining a Virginia Tech player. Whether that's Burgos or not, kind of unclear. There hasn't been anybody else other than Nakos that's kind of been reporting on that. But there's a lot of influx with figuring out who's going to be in and who's going to be out. It gets kind of more murky because you have the ACC player availability reports, but those only report on availability themselves, so you don't know how much of that comes down to injury. So going back to what I said, I think it's not rudderless. It feels like there's starting to have a direction, like you're starting to get an idea of who's bought in and who's not. But I still think that it's a wait and see as to how the rest of the season goes, wait and see as to who transfers out, who could transfer in with a new head coach. And then, wait and see about the athletic department and their budget increase, which is going to be $229 million over the next 4 years. $120 million of that total is coming from philanthropy. So there's a question of, can you actively raise that money? Do you get over that total? Do you get under that total? Do you get roughly around the same amount? That's to be determined, and I think that ends up showing more over the next couple months. But there's a lot of smoke and mirrors right now around Virginia Tech football, and I don't think that you're going to get the full picture of what exactly the plan for the future is until December, maybe even further.
So last question I'll ask you before we kind of get into players and stuff like that. Do you think the team has quit? Like, do you think that, you see this with some places that fire their coach. You get a little bit of an interim coach bump. Like, you might go win a game or two like you did. You lose your first game. It's kind of like, okay, we're 2-4 now. Like, you're almost certainly not going to make a bowl game. It's not impossible, but it's like probably 5 to 10%. But it's like, I kind of thought UCLA was dead in the water, and then they kind of just come out of nowhere and beat Penn State. So I guess that one of my key things I'm trying to figure out this week is like, okay, is Virginia Tech bought in and are they going to come here on the road, bought in, and like wanting to play this game?
I think so. I also wouldn't be surprised if something ends up happening. It seems like there's, if not a good sense, at least a neutral sense of optimism within what you're seeing when you're talking to interim head coach Philip Montgomery and some of the other players. You talk to the assistant coaches. It feels like things are, they're not great, but it's kind of chugging along like business as usual. But I wouldn't be surprised if something goes awry because, not in practice, you're not seeing what's actively going on. So it leaves part of it up to guesswork. So, take what you will from some of these post-game and post-media availability quotes. But I think right now things are solid, but I wouldn't say concretely that, all of the team is bought in. Because you've obviously seen some players move on. I don't think that those 4 are going to be the last. I do think that there are more players on the way. I don't know who as of yet, but I feel like there's still more to come on figuring out, okay, who's actively bought in, who might be somebody who leaves. On that note, you talk about the 4-game redshirt mark. That has played a huge role in figuring out like the future of this team. Like, for example, Tucker Holloway, who I believe is entertaining like some visits from Boise State, East Carolina. Like he's getting interest, but he had already played the 4-game mark. So for some of these players, you view it from the perspective of, okay, if you're a true junior, that's probably where it makes the most sense for you to transfer because then, you utilize a red shirt, then you have 2 years of eligibility and your next stop probably makes sense for the true sophomores as well. Maybe not so much for the freshmen who are prioritizing development. But again, like I said, I think it's just a wait and see kind of thing where you're not entirely sure because you're not in practice. Like it's different from Georgia Tech where you guys have that practice availability. Like to a certain extent, Virginia Tech media, it's kind of locked out because you can't see what's going on behind the scenes.
Yeah. You want to jump into players, RJ?
Yeah, I'm ready.
All right, let's do it. All right, so we'll go Virginia Tech offense versus Georgia Tech defense. And I think the matchup I think most people are going to want to see is Virginia Tech running the ball and Georgia Tech's rush defense because that's kind of been like last year it was a strength for Georgia Tech. This year, I don't think it's quite as bad as the numbers indicate. Me and RJ talked about this last week. I think the Wake Forest game we said was bad. They did not defend the run very well in that game. I think some other games, I think you got some, especially like the Temple game, I think you got some garbage time stats in. And I think when I watch Georgia Tech, they're not the 100th ranked rush defense. It doesn't seem like to me. Now I'm not sitting here saying they've been great or anything like that, but I think they're slightly better than what that shows. But whenever I watch Virginia Tech and when I look at their personnel, I feel like they should be a lot better than 69th in rushing. And they're not a terrible running team, but with the guys they brought in, like Terrion Stewart, Braden Bennett, Marcellus Hawkins, Kyron Drones. I'll say this about Kyron Drones. I think we kind of know he kind of is what he is at this point.
There's not really a lot of time left to kind of change it, so you're kind of stuck with what you've got.
He started out as a really toolsy quarterback with a lot of athleticism, strong arm rushing ability. It's okay, can he mash it all together? Was hurt last year, inconsistent. He had some good moments. I thought he played really well in that loss against Miami. I thought he genuinely was pretty good.
I agree with that.
I don't know. When I watch him this year, like I'll say this: I don't think highly of Virginia Tech's receivers when I watch them, and I know there's been a lot of mixing and matching on the offensive line, whether it's injury or just whatever. But it's like the one thing they do decently well is like Georgia Tech's biggest weakness so far, and I think that's like the one ticket they have to being able to move the ball and even possibly pulling what would be a pretty big upset is if they can run the ball. So I guess. Talk to us a little bit about Virginia Tech's offense and kind of strengths and everything like that.
So I think the main thing that you have to look at for this weekend is, number one, is Terrion Stewart going to be available? Had that career high 174-yard night against NC State, was the main reason why Virginia Tech walked out of Raleigh with the victory. Had that 85-yard run where he just broke, I believe it was three. He made three defenders miss on tackles. His availability is a question mark, like it was before the NC State game. One of the media members asked about Terrion's availability on Wednesday, and Montgomery was non-committal about it, saying, okay, we'll see how it goes. I would lean towards thinking that he would play just based on the fact that the same sort of thing was kind of happening before the NC State game of where you're like, okay, you'll see where you're at. Without Stewart, though, I think you run into a lot of questions about the rest of the run game because Marcellus Hawkins has been solid in stretches, but not really able to demarcate himself and kind of distinguish himself as a clear-cut RB1. The main thought beforehand was that Terrion Stewart was probably going to be the number one guy to start the season. Then he's kind of coming off injury a little bit. So that's okay, Hawkins kind of was a late bloomer in camp, at least from the way that Pride talked about him, and then he kind of just uses the RB1 role by default since Terrion wasn't dressed, I believe, for South Carolina. I think that Virginia Tech's rushing attack is solid enough. If you look at the stats, they've got a total of 931 over their 6 games as opposed to opponents 780. But then it's okay, average yards per carry is 4.5, opponents 3.9. They've done a really good job of limiting the run, as I mentioned earlier in the podcast, holding your last 3 opponents to under 100 yards. On that note, they limited Wofford to -1 net rushing yards, which you take that with the caveat of, yes, it's an FCS squad in Wofford, but to be that effective, I think the run defense is one that you have to pay attention to. Going back to the run game on offense, I think that you just have to reach the end zone more. Virginia Tech has only had 6 rushing touchdowns, and I believe 4 of those have came from drones. So if your backs only have 2 touchdowns, you're 6 games through the season, you've got a problem on that front. I think that the backs have proven to be effective in short spurts, but that the run game from Virginia Tech is not reliable enough to where you can be okay, this can anchor us and keep us competitive every single week.
Yeah, and I think there is a lot of legitimacy to the Virginia Tech run game. Probably going to bring up some sore memories for Georgia Tech fans here. But when, Terrion Stewart was at Bowling Green in 2023, again, I think a lot of people remember that game. Terrion Stewart had a night against the Georgia Tech defense. Again, I know that's 2 years ago. This is a completely different team. But he's been a legitimate running back for a while. And again, I think if he plays this game, I think that is the part where you could see the biggest issue for the Georgia Tech defense. But besides that, I would say talent-wise, there is a pretty solid gap between the Yellow Jackets defense and the Hokies offense, and I think that's a fair thing to say.
I agree, and I think that extends to the receiving core as well. Aiden Green coming into his junior year, done solid so far. He's averaging 43 receiving yards a game. Donovan Green, graduate transfer from Wake Forest. He leads the team in receiving yards right now at 274, so he's got an average of 17.1 yards per reception. So he's shown that ability to kind of break out and, grab those 20-yard catches or whatnot. I think there hasn't necessarily been like a super big breakaway play. There was one breakaway play where Aiden Green tallied a 67-yard reception, but you haven't really seen any big game plays aside from like brief stretches where it seems like Virginia Tech's offense is in flow. It seems like it's very sort of you start well and then you kind of sputter out midway through the drive. Like Virginia Tech's receiving core has 9 touchdowns this year. They've got about 1,200 yards, getting about 10.2 yards of reception. Their opponents are outmatching that, getting about 1,350, my apologies, and 12.5 yards of reception. So it's like the opponents are more effective with their receivers, and I haven't necessarily seen anything from Virginia Tech to make you think, okay, I don't think that one of these Virginia Tech receivers is going to have like a 75 to 100-yard night on Saturday in Atlanta. It seems like the receiving core is decent, but not necessarily a standout for Virginia Tech.
So I guess let's talk about drones for a little bit. Like I mentioned just a little bit ago, like, he transferred over from Baylor, had a really solid 2023 season. A lot of expectations were put on him, like take the next step. And like I said, he was injured a lot of 2024, couldn't really get right. Came into this year, new coordinator, all that. From a passing perspective, it hasn't gone super well. Like the only real game I think he's played just real good start to finish is that Wofford game. And like you've been saying, like take from that what you will. Like what's kind of been the issue with Drones this year? Like is it scheme? Is it receivers? Is it just, he's just not a complete quarterback? Like kind of like when you watch him, like what do you see?
I think it's a mix of all the above. Like you look at like Drones is kind of marketed as like, the dual threat quarterback. Most of his rushing touchdowns have come in like the short in the red zone, kind of just like punching it in from like 2 yards out. I don't think that Drones has done anything too special in terms of what he's done on the ground. I think he's always been, I'd say probably if you had to like rank his passing game from 1 to 10, I'd probably put it at like a 6 or a 7. Solid, but otherwise unremarkable. Like you said, his main game where he was kind of clicking was against Wofford. Like I've been saying a lot of times, take from that game what you will, because that kind of was the best highlight from Virginia Tech. But that also comes with it being a get-right game. I think that Drones played solidly enough against NC State. Obviously, I think he only got around like 200 passing yards. But, when you have Terrion Stewart go for a career high, 174 yards, goes on that big 80-yard dash. Like, he didn't really need to be like the marquee guy that night. I think, especially during Wake Forest, it felt like he was rushed into throws at the way that the offensive line was oriented. Felt like Wake Forest was very good at getting to him and forcing him into off-balance throws, getting him to throw the ball away. I think for Virginia Tech, if they want to win this week, you need Drones to play like he did against Wofford and make some of the big plays that he made against NC State. Like he had a really nice reception. It was almost a video game-esque throw where he tosses it up to Benji Gosnell, who reaches up and catches it right over his defender's head. Great throw by Drones, great catch by Gosnell there. But you need better awareness from Drones in the pocket, better escapability. You need him to function a bit more in the run game because I don't think that Drones has been a special passer. It's kind of just been like not necessarily winning in spite of him, but you don't see anything special on that front. You see a solid effort most night. You'll probably see around like 220 passing yards in like a decent solid win for the team. But at least for me, like I look at the offense and I see, okay, Drones is not elevating this offense.
Anything else on the offense, RJ?
Yeah, I just think my big thing with Kyron Drones is over the past 3 years, I think you've just kind of seen him settle into the job. Like the first year, there was some excitement. he went out and he was, like this very dynamic dual threat quarterback. And I think with every year, with every game that he plays, and I mean, just looking at the rushing numbers, first year averaged 4.9 yards per carry. The year after that, 3.4, and this year it's down to 2.6. You've kind of seen the regression. I don't want to say talent wise. I just want to say regression into the role where he's at. He's accepted what he's had to do. He makes the plays that he needs to make and doesn't really do anything super exemplary, whether that be in the run game or the pass game. He's not a negative quarterback by any means. He's kind of just
not necessarily somebody who elevates like the offense as a whole. I think that's a very good point. Like you look at it and it's like, okay, in the rushing game, like he's making marginal gains at most. And, the main thing about drones going into 2024, which was supposed to be a big year for Virginia Tech, is it's like, okay, we've got like this real like dual threat quarterback who can escape out of the pocket and who might not be the best passer, but that his legs opened him up. And then you have the injuries. He got a sprained MCL, a turf toe, and stress fracture. I believe he suffered 2 of those injuries during the Clemson game that knocked him out for the remainder of the season. I have no clue really how much of this season is down to any lingering effects from those injuries. I would bet not really that much, but at least from my perspective, I'm looking at the offense, and when you look at Virginia Tech's offense, you're not really seeing anything that makes you go, wow, like this guy is a bona fide playmaker. Aside really from Terrion Stewart against NC State, but you don't know if he can recreate that because you don't know if he's going to be playing this week.
Yeah, I mean, so I'll just kind of say this about Georgia Tech's defense. I think one key thing to note that Brink mentioned today, Kilo Stone is going to be out Saturday. He got banged up against Wake Forest. He's one of the top D tackles in the rotation. Is that just like a crippling blow? No, like a Kilo is good, but I don't think Georgia Tech's defense is suddenly just in serious peril because Kilo's out. But they play a lot of young guys on the defensive line, whether it's Christian Garrett, Andre Fuller, or Montre Bradford. Like those guys, the main thing for Georgia Tech in this game defensively is stopping the run. Like I think it's that simple. Like win on early downs and force drones into those 3rd and long situations, 2nd and long, and just really force him to be able to read the field and have to pick up those kind of first downs. Because when I watch Virginia Tech, I just don't think that that's going to happen. We'll wrap up the offense versus defense talk here. So Thomas, what is one strength what is one area you're confident in with this offense against Georgia Tech's defense, and what is one area that scares you?
All right, so this is going to be a twofold thing that, again, has to do with Terrion Stewart. I think the biggest strength is if he can get into that second level where, he breaks past the defensive line, he can make guys miss. Then you get into the question of, okay, if he's not able to go, then what do you have? Because Stewart, he has 307 yards 307 yards gained on 35 carries this year. Marcellus Hawkins, who's the second guy up, he started all 6 games, but numbers-wise, he's the second best running back in terms of average. For Hawkins, he has 295 net yards on 282 net yards, 295 gain on 55 carries. So you're like, okay, Terrion is more the guy that can break away. And you kind of need more of that breakaway against a team like Georgia Tech. You need somebody who can kind of pound it out, get 10 yards at a time. Like Terrion had something, I believe it was at least 7 first downs against NC State 2 weeks ago. If you have him ready to go against Georgia Tech and you get even remotely a performance like that, maybe not have that 85-yard gain. But even apart from that, he tallied I think he tallied something like 90 rushing yards on 14 carries. That's a pretty serviceable number, just over 6 yards a carry. You get something like that, I think that you can get in a decent discussion of, okay, Virginia Tech can keep this game close. I don't think that they'll win. I'll get into that when we get into our score prediction. But I think it all hinges on whether Terrion Stewart is able to play. And then also, one thing that I'm worried about is with the offensive line's orientation, because you don't know if tackle Johnny Garrett is going to be able to go on Saturday. And he's one of the most experienced guys on that unit. You've had to move Remack around a lot. Remack has played now 4 positions at the O-line. The only position that he hasn't played is at center because his teammate Kyle Altuner has had that locked up the entire season. So you've had to do a lot of shuffling around in the offensive line. Still haven't seen any Jaden Muskrat, I believe. You have Brody Meadows out for the year, presumably. That's what Montgomery was inkling at a couple weeks ago. One of the media saw him, I believe he was on a scooter, and it looked like he had just had a procedure. So that's just another blow. And it seems like Virginia Tech's offensive line, if they can create enough space for Stewart to get out, I think that will be very good in terms of aiding Virginia Tech's win chances this Saturday. But if Stewart's not able to go, worse enough, you get more injuries to the offensive line. I think that Georgia Tech probably has this comfortably if either of those two, not necessarily worst case scenarios, but if any of those two bad scenarios happen, I think that they still have a very good chance of winning regardless. Like, Virginia Tech is 14.5-point dogs for good reason here. Georgia Tech's very, very solid.
All right. Let's flip this discussion around and let's talk about Georgia Tech's offense against Virginia Tech's defense. And it almost feels like we're going to kind of talk about some similar aspects of the game because, like, one of the things Virginia Tech has been really good at pretty much all season, like they've been good at limiting the run. Like, are they like Miami or Ohio State in terms when it comes to run defense? No, they're not that good. But, like, they really limited South Carolina. Like, they tore South Carolina's offensive line apart, like, just to be honest. Like, they really got after them in that game. Last week against Wake Forest, Demon Deacons had 91 yards on 32 carries. And, like, I'll remind you, like, Wake Forest ran for over 200 yards on Georgia Tech just a few weeks ago. So, obviously, Georgia Tech's offense hinges a lot on being able to run the ball. Me and RJ talked last week, like, you know, really in Power 4 games, like it's against Wake Forest, against Colorado, and against Clemson. The running backs have not really done much. Like, they're too big. Jamal Haynes and Malachi Hosley have not done a lot in those 3 games. Their biggest, you know, performances have come against Gardner-Webb and against Temple. So for me, like, what I want to see from Georgia Tech's offense is, one, explosiveness in the pass game, because I think you're going to have to – I think Virginia Tech's just going to commit numbers to the run game, and I think you're just going to have to beat them in some situations. And then, 2, like, just Jamal Haynes and Malachi Hosley, I think just have to alleviate some of that pressure off of Haynes King. Look, I know the offense runs through Haynes King. I know Haynes King is going to get carries no matter what, especially in games like this. I still think it's just not sustainable to have him carrying it 20, 25 times, you know, and so, like, we have 7 more games to go.
And especially if he gets injured too, like he did last year, like you run into that issue of, okay, now you've got to rely on Philo again, but Philo might not provide that same level of, maybe not necessarily a safety blanket, but somebody to rely on. Like,
yeah.
At least for me, when I look at Virginia Tech's defense, it seems like it's very young and inexperienced. Part of that has to do with the fact that linebacker Caleb Woodson has only played 3 games so far this season. He's been out for a little bit with an injury. Doesn't really seem like Montgomery will go into much about what it is. Quentin Reddish has also been out. He tallied an interception against Vanderbilt, but he's been out. On that note, Virginia Tech has tallied, I believe, 3 interceptions this year. And one of them was from Kamari Copeland, and it came, I believe, against Wofford, where it was a tipped ball from the defensive line, and he just jumped on it and was able to corral it down. And then you had Reddish getting his interception against Vanderbilt, where Diego Pavia throws into double coverage. Just, I didn't really understand what was going on in that throw, because usually it feels like Diego Pavia, a very sound guy with the football, obviously, this year. But Reddish comes down with it, but Reddish hasn't played in, I believe, a month at this point. And then the other interception was from Isaiah Brown Murray, another tip ball. And this was an interesting scenario because it came at Wake Forest's 4-yard line, and Virginia Tech did not score a touchdown on that drive. They were restrained to a field goal. So I think that speaks to, okay, the defense is able to create opportunities, but then the offense can't really capitalize on them because, you fail to punch it in from the 4-yard line when you're basically gifted the perfect interception. But the defense hasn't had too many chances to create opportunities like that. And I talked really nicely about the run defense from their performances against Wofford, NC State, and Wake Forest. But for the 2-game stretch between Vanderbilt and Old Dominion, that group really struggled. I think you've seen the defensive line and the linebacker core, the quarterbacks and the safeties, they've kind of taken a little bit of a jump since. But, like, for example, I wouldn't say that the cornerbacks and the safeties have done an outstanding job of limiting the passing game of other quarterbacks. Like, I think that they did a serviceable job enough on C.J. Bailey in the second half. In the first half, Bailey was pinpoint. I think he only missed 2 of his passes in the first half. Keaton in the second half got that key 4th down stop with Christian Ellis, like, tallying the pass breakup, but then Ellis didn't play the next week. You don't know what his availability is like. Of note, Christian Ellis is at the 4-game mark. Other players, James Janez at the 4-game mark. Caleb Woodson has been out, but he's at the 3-game mark. So you pay attention again to the 4-game redshirt mark of where you might get into that problem. I would say, though, that there's been some freshmen that have stood out, particularly cornerback JoJo Krim. He's the only freshman at this point right now that's at the 4-game discussion. But yesterday when talking to cornerbacks coach Derek Jones, the thought initially before the season was that they were going to be able to redshirt both JoJo Krim and Jamari DeLoach. Now those two have kind of been forced into early action. Krim so far has done solid enough in coverage to where, okay, you don't feel like it's a super big drop-off from somebody like Dante Lovett, who's now in the portal, working out where he's going to go next. And then in the linebacker front, you lost Michael Short. He played the 4-game max, and he's not with the program anymore, unknown as to where he goes next as of now. I'd say probably the highlight of the defensive groups has been the defensive line. Specifically, I'd point to Kamari Copeland. He has 22 tackles so far, has 2 tackles for loss, and then the aforementioned interception that he came up with against Wofford. Funny note on that end, when I asked Sam Seifkes about what his reaction was to Copeland making the catch, and Seifkes responded with that he didn't know if Copeland could catch the ball. So great response from Seifkes on that front. I think that the defensive line has done a good job of getting to the quarterback, although that has proven to be a little bit volatile too. It's the same thing for a lot of these groups where you deal with a lot of volatility. And especially against NC State, like, the defensive line looked really good. Like, they were able to get to C.J. Bailey, take him down 5 times. Then the next week you go up against Robbie Ashford. I believe he was slightly injured because he went down against Georgia Tech. So he's not at 100%, but you only were able to pin him down for 1 sack. And you let Ashford put up 250 plus yards. I think it was a little bit over 250. So I think that there are some standouts. Caleb Spencer from the linebacker core has been another standout in addition to Copeland and some others that I mentioned earlier. Spencer has 13 solo tackles and 30 total tackles. And I believe he had an 11 tackle night against NC State. If he can recreate that performance and, if the rest of the defense can key in on stopping King in regards to him finding his receivers, I think that you can sort of get into that discussion. But off that note, I don't think that Virginia Tech has the skill players at that position or enough of the skill players at that position to where you can be effective enough to stop Haynes King. Because you talk about Kyron Jones being the dual threat quarterback. Haynes King is a dual threat quarterback.
He is the dual threat quarterback. So I guess RJ, like when you're looking at these two units going against each other, kind of like what are you looking to see? Players need to step up. Kind of like just any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think my big thing is taking care of the football in terms of Georgia Tech offense. You look at turnover margin. Georgia Tech is third to last in the ACC in turnover margin. The only teams that are lower than you in that category is Syracuse and Boston College. We've talked about Boston College having a horrible season. Georgia Tech, honestly, having a lot more fumbles than we could have ever expected from a Haynes and Haynes offense. And you look at Virginia Tech defense. They allow their opponents to score on 100% of red zone trips. They're 129th in the FBS and red zone defense. And I think if you do your job, you don't fumble the ball, you allow yourself to get into Virginia Tech territory, that's where you've kind of seen the Hokies struggle this year. They haven't been able to stop offenses after a big game. The whole bend don't break, idea they haven't, really worked with this year. They broke on almost every single drive. And I think if you do your best, give your skill guys a position to, break a tackle or two, I think this is the part where you see, the good on bad. I think the Georgia Tech offense is, by far Georgia Tech's best unit. And, the VT defense, even though I will give them credit, they have been good at times. It's a very inexperienced unit, and there's not a ton of depth everywhere, like we've talked about. Guys transferring out and you losing a lot of guys to injury. I think that's the spot for Georgia Tech to find, their biggest gain in this game. And I think if you get into the red zone a lot, like I said, they allow opponents to score on 100% of red zone trips. So as long as you get there, I think you'll be fine.
Yeah, I mean, like I think you pretty much summed it up. Like I'm looking for more consistency from the running back, somebody to step up. Like my player that needs to step up and player to watch is Jamal Haynes. Like you could
Absolutely.
go for Malachi Hoser. Like I'm waiting on the big against a Power 14 big breakout game from Jamal. Like we all know can happen. I think he's really got to step up this week. Yeah, I mean, you talked about faster start. Look, they were down big to Wake Forest because of a poor start. They've had a problem with turnovers early in games. And look, we talked about what was he against Temple. Like we've had two straight games where Georgia Tech just gets absolutely dusted in the second quarter. Like that Temple game looked like it was going to be on the verge of a massive blowout. And then they have like 9 yards in the second quarter, and then Temple really couldn't take advantage. And then Wake Forest had like 200 something yards alone in the second quarter last time. Like they've 2 straight games now. We've had a problem with Georgia Tech not being able to do much in that quarter. But look, again, it depends on which Virginia Tech run defense shows up, because I think Thomas made a good point. Like past couple of games in the South Carolina game, like I know South Carolina had over 100 something yards, but they only averaged like barely 3 yards a carry. Like it wasn't a very good game from them.
Like Lenore Sellers was like a non-factor.
Yeah, right. Like Lenore Sellers, and like that's I think one thing to note. Like I mean, like I think Lenore Sellers is a better athlete than Haynes King, but they're both like good running quarterbacks, and that's something I'm keeping an eye on. Last 2 weeks they've been really good against Wake Forest, NC State. They had 2 weeks where like Vanderbilt and Old Dominion each averaged over 6 yards a carry against them. So it's going to be like which one shows up. But like, again, I think the game just boils down to, and just to kind of put a finer point on things, like can Georgia Tech get off to a good start? Can they be able to run the ball when they want to? Can they stay in short yard situations, not in these third and longs? And can they stop the run? And that's whether it's drones. Like we've seen some decent running games from quarterbacks. Like Robbie Ashford did a pretty good job of being able to run around. Caden Salter was okay, not great, but like he made some plays. And like that's just like Temple's quarterback, honestly, got out on the perimeter and made some plays. So I'm interested to see how they use Kyron Jones in that way. But I guess that all this talk, all this everything, some of it's been Virginia Tech focused, because Georgia Tech hasn't played since we talked about it at the bye week, so not a lot's changed, but we've kind of given you the keys to the game and everything. So we let guests go first on here, because we're just and I'll also make the point. I'm so glad RJ brought up the Terry and Stewart thing, because it was in the back of my mind, but I was like, I'll let RJ say that. I'm not bringing that game up. So I'll let RJ take that bullet. But will we let guests go first on here? I know you're not going to be able to be at the game, Thomas, but what
I will not be attending the game. I'm not going to be in Atlanta. Not covering the game, actually. Instead, it'll be Keaton Reinhardt taking the mantle for Virginia Tech on SI. I'm celebrating my 20th birthday on Saturday.
Birthday coming up.
So passing the baton here for a little bit. We'll be back in action after Tech's bye week. I'll be able to cover for Cal and, move forward with the rest of the season. But, this weekend, I think that Virginia Tech loses, goes down to 2-5. I don't think that it's going to be an overwhelming loss like it was with Vanderbilt, especially in the second half or against Old Dominion, where, it's not going to be an evisceration. But I also don't think that's going to be a particularly close affair. I have Georgia Tech winning this one 30-17. Barely. I'm picking Virginia Tech against the spread. I'm picking Virginia Tech to cover the spread this week, which they've only done one time so far this year. Virginia Tech is 1-5 against the spread, and that was that one win against the spread came in week 5 against NC State. Tech has not beaten the spread at all, apart from there.
We're about to see unstoppable force meets immovable objects here because Georgia Tech does not cover big spreads. I'll let RJ, you go ahead, and then I'll go.
Hydrogen bomb meets crying baby.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I mean, they say good teams win, great teams cover. So we're going to see who's a great team. And I do want to, while I have the spot for you here for a second, I do want to admit my faults because before the season, I wouldn't say I was huge on Virginia Tech, but I think I gave them a lot more credit than what they ended up being this season. But now that we're here, now that Virginia Tech, 2-4 at this point in the season, 1-1 in the ACC, I think this is the week where you start to see them tail off a little bit. Again, we talked about, once you get an interim coach, you do get like a little bit of a bump. You play a little bit more motivated football, and play a little bit more than your talent shows. I think we're starting to see a regression in that. There is, I say this all the time, there is talent in some spots on these teams, but overall there's a big talent differential in this game. I think there's a big coaching differential in this game. I don't think there's one spot where I would pick Virginia Tech over Georgia Tech in any category, whether that be rush offense, pass
I think
offense.
the only one that you can make a case for is special teams, John Love. But
that's actually an excellent point. So before
special teams does not always win the game here. Like, unless John Love can kick 7 field goals, I don't think that Virginia Tech walks out.
Yeah, I was gonna say I think this is the kicker matchup of the year in the ACC. Like, this is what all you specialists out there, fans of special teams, I know you're going to be dialed into this. Aiden Burr versus John Love, like, that doesn't get more riveting. Neither one of them's missed a field goal this season. Like, are you kidding me?
Somebody called the
Love has missed 2 field goals. Love has missed 2 field goals. Love missed 2 field goals. One was a 59-yarder right before the second half against Wofford.
That's right.
Yeah. And then I think he missed a 30. It was somewhere around 30 yards against Wake Forest. So other than that, he's been incredibly pinpoint. I think he hit something like a 56-yarder against South Carolina. Like, you put him in there, like, anything within 50 yards, like, he'll hit it like 9.5 times out of 10.
Yeah, I was reading his extra point stats. He hadn't missed an extra point. I was like, dang, we're gonna enter this game with two kickers that have not missed a field goal. Like, that's incredible. Like, that's just you don't see that much. But okay, well, I'll have to lower my expectations a little bit. But again, sorry to interrupt you, RJ, but like this is an absolutely elite special teams matchup.
Yeah, but getting back to Virginia Tech Georgia Tech matchup team as a whole, I just think the talent level is a lot bigger in this game than we talked about in previous games. I think this is where you start to see the bottom fall out for Virginia Tech. I'm gonna say Georgia Tech wins this game 31-14. I could see a world where Virginia Tech does back end cover, or the game is a lot closer than it should be if Georgia Tech starts slow. But again, Georgia Tech needs to start coming into their own, start with these quick starts. that that we've talked about that will get you further in the season than you need to, to maybe talk about an ACC championship or a college football playoff. We've talked about it starts with games like this, and it starts, with a dominant performance. So I'm going with the big win for the Yellow Jackets.
All right. So I do think Georgia Tech wins. They're going to have to prove to me that they can cover this. And look, covering the spreads isn't everything, but like they have to prove to me as big favorites that they're going to go out and play a complete game from start to finish. They have not played a complete game from start to finish like all season. I think Virginia Tech will cover. I could see like a backdoor cover, like Georgia Tech kind of just controls things, and then Virginia Tech gets a late score. Like I think my hesitate, like there was why I wanted to ask Thomas earlier about like the buy-in factor, like RJ was saying, like with some of these teams, you get an interim coach, you get a little bit of a bump. Hey, we're playing inspired football. You win 2 games, you go pull a big upset against NC State as a double-digit underdog. Come back down to earth a little bit against Wake Forest. Now you're 2-4. You're no longer unbeaten in ACC play. Making a bowl game is increasingly unlikely. Like there's just a lot of things going on there. And there's like okay, when could the bottom fall out? If it does, like, we've seen interim coaches, like Brent Key was almost in the exact same position, and he rallied his team to a 5-7 record. And I'm not saying like Philip Montgomery, Brent Key, obviously, but like, if you can get that buy-in each week and get them to play hard, like, I think, you can still compete. Like I said, he got them to 5-7 after a really terrible start in 2022. I think Georgia Tech wins. I'm going to go 34-23, something like that. Like, I don't think the game's ever going to be in doubt, but I think Georgia Tech's just going to go in there and just steamroll Virginia Tech unless they just lay down and quit. Like, and that's, again, I could see Georgia Tech maybe getting up in the first quarter. You get like a 2-score lead, and then Virginia Tech folds. Again, there's just some of these intangible factors and variables I think you could throw into this game where that are just kind of hypothetical and unpredictable. But again, I like Georgia Tech to win. I like them to get to 6-0 for the first time since 2011, which is incredible. Well, that's going to do it for this show today. Thomas, we appreciate you coming on, sharing your wealth of knowledge. Where can the people find you? Social media, plug anything you want to plug right here.
All right, so my X account is at Thomas Hughes _05. So obviously I do work with Virginia Tech on SI, lead editor over there. I also write for Virginia Tech student newspaper, the Collegiate Times, write for 3304 Sports, which is another student media organization on campus. So you can kind of find me all over in terms of the Virginia Tech sports media field. The only place that you can't really find me is with working on Virginia Tech sports broadcasting. I don't have the broadcasting chops. I know I don't.
I did. We're gonna get that rolling here. Like this is gonna be your intro into that.
I'll have the podcasting stuff locked down eventually.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great resume. Whoever hired you, that's a smart.
That would be you.
Yeah. Who knows? But yeah, we really appreciate you joining us today. Hey, usually sometimes with our guests, I'll say, hey, maybe we'll see you later down the road in Charlotte or see you later. I don't know that we're going to see you for a long time. So we appreciate you coming on here. Maybe
it's a bowl game, maybe.
Yeah, we'll see. We might bring you on for like some basketball or baseball talk or just something like that. Cause hey, I'm buying the Virginia Tech stock this year in basketball.
Virginia Tech men's basketball. Obviously, I don't have a vote. If I had to put a vote, I would put them at number 6 in the ACC this season. I think you just look at how much depth Mike Young has been able to compile this season. Obviously, the big name Hall, Neoclis of Dallas, only the second 5-star recruit ever to set foot on campus. The first one was Dorian Finney-Smith all the way back in 2011 when I was 6 years old. So I have no recollection of that from my front. But, this is a team that for the first time really under Mike Young's tenure, like they have like that super high-end talent that, you think can go out there and really, really compete in the ACC. Like I think I could see them being top 5. I think you've got a lot more depth over there. You've got experienced transfers coming in like Jalen Bedford from UNLV and Oral Roberts. You got Isaiah Pasha coming in. This is going to be great off the ball. Back to Bedford. Young actually said that Bedford has been the team's best, I believe, on-ball defender. And then he also said that Pasha will work a lot off the ball. He also said Avdalis will play a lot of time at the 1. And if you think about that from a height perspective, you just think, okay, what if a potential lineup of Neoclis Avdalis, who's 6'8", like let's say at the 2 guard you have Isaiah Pasha, who I believe is 6'4", 6'5". You have Tyler Johnson at the 3, who is 6'5". At power forward, you run with Toby Lawal, who's 6'8", and then you end up having Amani Hansberry at that center spot. And on that note, he's, I believe Young said that he's like the best 5 in like a connector capacity since Aluma. So at that point, this team is probably one of, if not the best, that I think that Young has had. And to that end, I think that he is consistently he's consistently outdone with the crew that he's been given, especially last year. You lost basically your entire starting lineup, and you struggled. You lost 6 games in a row, but then you started to pick it back up, and you captured some nice wins, especially against Syracuse. Obviously, the year didn't end the way that you wanted it to. Got badly beaten by UNC at home. That was a game where I kind of had half of the game recap done by like midway through the 4th quarter, because it was kind of like a game that like you knew was over, like with like 5 minutes left in the 3rd. And then you end up losing a heartbreaker in double overtime to Cal in the ACC tournament. But I think that for men's basketball this year, I wouldn't say that the sky's the limit, but I would say that I think that's a team that we could see dancing in March this year.
Hey, you heard the nicest things you're going to hear about Virginia Tech on our Georgia Tech podcast. There you go. We really appreciate you joining us, Thomas. That's going to do it for today's episode. Like we always say, guys, if you're watching this show, haven't subscribed, we'd love it if you would join the family. We're growing quite a bit. Would love it if you would subscribe, like the video, hit that notification bell so you know when new content's going up. Follow us wherever you get your podcast. Leave us a review. We will be back with an instant reaction show Saturday. We will see if it's happy, if it's a little sad, if it's a little bit of both. Like we've had at times this year where it's like we're mostly happy, but it's like, hey, there's some frustrating things in here. Well, either way, we will be there. Yeah, it could be a mix. I will be in my car, which I know that's everybody's favorite episodes, when Jackson's in his car with like barely any lighting and some weird sound. But we will be back then, and
smooth lighting.
That's right. Appreciate you for tuning in.